After the Battle of Lake Erie, 2 equal individual medals were struck. One of those medals was for Oliver Hazard Perry, of course. And the other one was for a Captain Jesse Duncan Elliott. As far as the United States government was concerned, their contributions to the Battle of Lake Erie were equal. But see, the press of the time loved Perry. Elliott, not so much. In fact, Elliott's name was literally dragged through the dirt in order to play up Perry's story, to give it more intrigue, as if the story that I just got done telling you could actually be made better. Is there anybody who thinks that story needed to be any better? It's great just the way that it is. Now, some of those stories actually called Elliott a coward, saying he was much too scared to bring the Niagara into the fight. Others proclaim that Elliott was jealous of Perry and that he intentionally held the Niagara out of harm's way so that Perry might be killed so that he could ascend to the command of the fleet. Depending on which newspapers you read and where you might have read them, there were varying degrees of insults, innuendos, and outright falsehoods. It got so bad that he demanded and he received a court-martial, where he was not only exonerated, but he was actually commended for his contributions to the Battle of Lake Erie. For the next 5 years, he begged Perry to proclaim his courage and valor. Just tell him, come on, just tell it like it was. But Perry, enjoying the limelight, never did. Perry died from yellow fever a mere 5 years later. And Elliott, enshrined and immortalized forever as a great American hero, while Elliott spent the rest of his life cursed with unwarranted aggravations. Now this is his story. Back in 1812, Lieutenant Jesse Duncan Elliott was a chubby guy, and he wasn't really quite as confident as Oliver Hazard Perry was. I've actually heard one historian call him a schluck. Now, he'd only been in the Navy for 8 years, and he had none of the familial connections that Oliver Hazard Perry had. But he did have one thing. He was an excellent commander. He was good at his job. He was so good at his job, in fact, over 3 months before Perry even got his orders, in October of 1812, he was called to Black Rock, or Buffalo at the time, to confer with a General Van Rensselaer concerning the building of a fleet to operate on Lake Erie. Now, what's the first thing that you need for a fleet to operate on Lake Erie? Ships. See, the British had already commandeered almost every ship on Lake Erie. Now, Elliott was bright and adventuresome, and lying with what seemed easy reach over at Fort Erie, just across the way from Black Rock, were 2 captured American ships. One which was called the Adams, which the British had mounted 6 guns on, and the other one was the Caledonia, which only had 2 guns on. Now, Elliott was a trusted friend of the Seneca Indians. So the Seneca chief, Farmer's brother, told him something to the effect of, you know, if you snuck across Lake Erie over there in the middle of the night, you could probably steal those ships back. Well, Elliott thought that was a killer idea, so on October the 9th, at 1 o'clock in the morning, Lieutenant Elliott set out on 3 ships, on 3 rowboats, with 100 or so guys, and rowed across Lake Erie. The boats silently crossed, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, both of the ships were simultaneously boarded. The surprise was complete. Elliott, in his report, stated that in less than 10 minutes, I had the prisoners all seized, the top sails were sheeted home, and the vessels were underway. But now we start noticing a pattern that the proverbial winds of war never seem to go Elliott's way. Try though they might, Elliott could not get the Adams far beyond the reach of Fort Erie, of the guns of Fort Erie. They even tried tying both of the ships together, but to no avail. Finally, he was forced to cut his cable and set the Adams adrift, where she grounded on the west side of Squaw Island and had to withstand the successive battering of not only the guns of Fort Erie, but also the guns of Black Rock Naval Yard. They eventually got a couple guns off of her, but the Adams was rendered a total loss to both sides. The Caledonia, however, was a rich prize, her cargo valued over $200,000, which was supplies meant for the British fort at Amherstburg. Lieutenant Elliott had captured 58 men in the raid, including 3 commissioned officers. He also released 27 Americans found on board. Elliott lost 1 man killed and had 4 wounded. Now, does this guy sound like a coward to you? Me neither. Well, Elliott, the government either. Elliott was promoted to captain by the head of the Great Lakes region, a Commodore Isaac Chauncey. And Elliott became the best commander Chauncey had. Lake Erie and the others beyond Lake Erie were all considered backwaters by the upper command of both the Americans and the British. And Chauncey wanted Elliott on Lake Ontario where all the action was. So while Perry was building his precious little fleet on Lake Erie, Elliott was busy building and training his crew on Lake Ontario. His crew, the crew he trained, fought in several battles on Lake Ontario, and he turned them into some of the most awesome naval seamen west of the Hudson River. See, Chauncey didn't really trust this new guy, Perry, and he couldn't really do anything about Perry being in charge of the fleet in Erie. But he knew that if he put Elliott in there, whatever he needed to get done would get done. So he ordered Perry to put Elliott in command of the Niagara. Now, Perry was absolutely thrilled to have Elliott and his men. And what commander wouldn't be? Battle-trained naval seamen don't grow on trees. No, Perry and Elliott really didn't get along, but then again, they didn't really need to. All they had to do was their jobs. Vain? Possibly. Jealous? Maybe. But they were professional, always. Besides, Elliott didn't need Perry. He had Chauncey, his immediate superior. Elliott's career was in absolutely no danger. Elliott had an equal ship to that of Perry's. The two were identical. And he had a vastly superior crew to that of Perry's. Elliott wasn't worried, even if Perry was. But Elliott's crew could sail rings around Perry's crew. It took 2 days for Perry to get the Lawrence over the sandbar. Elliott's guys did it in less than 24 hours. But Perry had already promised the command of the Niagara to a guy named Daniel Turner, who in turn was delegated to command Elliott's Caledonia that he brought down with him. Turner went from a 20-gun brig to a 3-gun frigate. And this demotion struck Turner raw and hard. Indignant and jealous, you bet. And these personal feelings would only become aggravated by Perry's written orders for battle. With the fever that Perry had in the days before the beginning of the battle, his ability to command was being extremely hampered. His written orders were, the commanding officers are particularly enjoined to pay attention in preserving their stations in the line, and in all cases keep as close to the Lawrence as possible. Engage your designated adversary in close action at a half cable's length. But in the days before the battle, the feverish Perry kept shuffling his fleet. First, the Niagara was to be in front, then the Caledonia, then the Lawrence, then the rest of the ship. The next day, he wanted a smaller vessel up in front, then the Niagara, then the Lawrence, then the Caledonia, then the rest of the fleet. The next day, he wanted the Lawrence up front, followed by the Niagara, the Caledonia, and then etc. And then on September 10th, the day of the battle, with his written orders still the same, he shuffled his fleet again. thanks to Perry's waffling, not one of his commanding officers were absolutely sure where their place in the line was, or who their designated adversary was. And on September 10th, as the British fleet approached them, Perry now had a couple of smaller ships up in front, then the Lawrence, then the Caledonia, then the Niagara, and then the rest of the fleet. And at noon on September 10th of 1813, the light and contrary winds of war shifted to the American advantage, and Perry's ship got full billows and took right off, at a pace far beyond what the rest of the fleet could manage, save the Niagara. Now Elliott thought Perry was absolutely insane, leaving the rest of the fleet behind like that. When you went into battle, you didn't go and try to fight it all by yourself. You approached your adversary in rank, and you fired on them all at once to combine all your strength. Speeding away from the fleet like that was just considered suicide. And if you look at what happened to the Niagara during the battle, it actually was. Because of their station in the line, when the wind actually went good for the Niagara, it was actually blocking all the wind from the Caledonia. So the Caledonia didn't move at all. Elliott had to hard his ship to port to keep from plowing right into the Caledonia. And when he did, it shifted his sails parallel to the breeze, and he lost all of his momentum. And the wind died, and he wasn't going anywhere, as Perry continued barreling on towards the British line. Now both of Perry's ships were stuck there as the Lawrence continued to bound towards the British. The Caledonia starts firing her long-range guns, and Elliott starts firing his long-range guns at the Queen Charlotte. But the real power of the Niagara was the carronades. But those 18 32-pound cannons were useless, stuck behind the Caledonia, as well as being out of range. So Elliott continuously fired his long guns at the Queen Charlotte, and they were never silent until his ammo started running out. After an hour of constant fire, the Niagara had run out of all her long-range ammo. But Elliott knew where a whole bunch of it was, over on the Lawrence. So he ordered his crew, a few guys in his crew, to drop a rowboat over to the side, row the whole way over to the Lawrence, under the fire and the view of the British, grab all their long-range shells, and bring them back to the Lawrence, to the Niagara, which they do. And then Elliott looks up, after they leave, Elliott looks up and he sees the Queen Charlotte start passing the Hunter and start firing into the Lawrence. Well, Elliott knows that he's got to do the same, so do that so that he can engage his designated adversary, which was the Queen Charlotte. He was going to have to pass the Caledonia. But Daniel Turner won't let him. Why? Because Turner had his written orders that said that he was to stay in line and keep as near to the Lawrence as possible. And the argument between the two of them became fierce. Both of them were screaming at each other from the decks of their ship. Every foul word you can imagine was said. Every curse was felt in earnest. Well, once the rowboat that Elliott sent over to the Lawrence got back, he was equally surprised to find that instead of it bringing the ammo back that he needed, it brought back Perry and his little brother. Well, Elliott looks at Perry and says something to the effect was, "Well, how goes your day?" To which Perry said, "Well, I fear the day is lost." To which Elliott says, "No, it's not. Tell the Caledonia, get the hell out of the way. I'm going to roll out to all the smaller and more maneuverable ships and try to get them to concentrate all their fire on the larger enemy ships. You take the Niagara and try to get closer to the Queen Charlotte and Detroit so that you can blast them with my carronade." See, with Elliott's trained crew, Elliott wasn't worried. His men were so disciplined and so well trained and so good that he knew the Niagara would perform admirably, even with Perry's 13-year-old little brother on board. But as Elliott rows off to the smaller vessels, gets the smaller vessels headed towards the battle. The British are firing at him the whole time as he rows from one ship to another ship, to another ship. Perry only made that trip once. But unable to continue, the Lawrence finally strikes her colors. And then all of a sudden, poof, the light and contrary winds of war again shift to the American advantage. And the Niagara goes to full sail, and Oliver Hazard Perry, on Elliott's ship, with Elliott's crew, sails off into American naval history and immortality. Elliott had rowed to all the smaller ships under the constant fire from the enemy, got them to concentrate their fire on the entangled British brigs. The British commander himself said that the fire from the smaller ship actually proved much more destructive to his fleet than any of the carronades of the Niagara. It wasn't until he was injured by some of their grape shot that was fired from the smaller vessels that he finally strikes his colors. Yes, the battle was over 15 minutes after Perry broke the British line. But it wasn't because of Perry. It was because of Jesse Duncan Elliott. Now, as Perry was writing his "We have met the enemy and they are ours" note, Elliott dons on his best uniform and boards the Detroit to accept Captain Robert Heroux Barclay's sword. As he boards the Detroit, the groans of the dead and dying echo across the ship. Almost all of her men had been killed, and their blood flowed streams across the listed decks. As Elliott crosses the deck towards their severely wounded commander, his heel finds one of those streams, and he falls into a puddle of gore. It ruins his best jacket and his best white pair of pants. But that wasn't the final insult of this battle, because nothing Elliott ever did could ever stave off the sting of the press's accusations of cowardice, which he had never shown. But here again, that's not the history of the Battle of Lake Erie. That's just his story. Thank you.